The bloodiest duel in the last 60 years saw the Soviet AK-47 and the American M16 face off. It was in Vietnam that America first encountered its worst enemy, the AK-47, a gun bearing the name of its inventor, Kalashnikov. Present and correct in every war, every battle, every slaughter. The invasion of Afghanistan, the Israeli-Arab conflict, guerrilla skirmishes in Africa, the wars in Iraq, and even in the suburbs of Europe and the United States. Kalashnikov and M16 were locked in a tussle for world dominance. The rustic, easy-to-use AK-47, created by Sergeant Mikhail Kalashnikov, outclassed Eugene Stoner's modern, sophisticated M16. At the height of the Cold War, the Kalashnikov was the weapon that symbolized the Soviet bloc, a veritable legend associated with every revolution, whereas the M16 armed those dictatorships supported by the United States.
It would seem that someone that had designed a weapon that was, one of the two weapons that was now the most famous in the world, okay, and used against each other, would feel shame that something that you've designed could be so deadly and would kill people. When you design this, in your mind, you are thinking in terms of your country needs this gun in order to protect itself, and that it will never be used against innocent people.
This footage is already 25 years old. His name is Mikhail Kalashnikov. His gun, the AK-47 that bears his name. Kalashnikov. He has no regrets, he says, as he invented this weapon to defend his motherland, the USSR. Eugene Stoner is the father of the M16, the American answer to the Russian gun. One Russian and one American, two players in the most deadly duel of the last 60 years.
Thank you.
Weapons know no frontiers, neither geographical, not social, nor religious, nor even sexual. In Kurdistan, women have adopted the Kalashnikov to defend themselves, latterly against the troops of Saddam Hussein, presently against the religious crackpots of Daesh. And here's a propaganda postcard of Daesh women posing with the American M16.
These women bear their arms without love. They no longer know how to love. They have lost their tenderness and their humanity. But this photo is nothing but propaganda. Daesh took it for its propaganda arsenal. In reality, these women are trained to kill, and do so by blowing themselves up. I freely admit that ever since my childhood, I have loved the Kalashnikov. And believe me, it's exactly the same love as I have for my child. It is my friend, and it accompanies me always. I love my Kalashnikov dearly because since my childhood, I've understood that it was there to save my freedom.
They are students, doctors, and housewives, but they're also peshmergas, which in Kurdish means those who confront death. They have come to haunt their adversaries, men convinced that they will not go to paradise if they are killed by a woman. In the United States, it is enshrined in law. The Second Amendment authorizes every citizen to keep and bear arms. So carrying, collecting, and using a Kalashnikov or an M16 is all just part of American daily life.
The M16 series rifle has been the longest-serving U.S. small arm in history, with over 50 years of service. And that has been because of its adaptability to the modern battlefield, from the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq.
Christopher Bartocci owns one of the finest collections of M16s in Texas. From the first model used in Vietnam to the version made for Desert Storm in Iraq, he has them all.
This rifle has perhaps the finest human engineering of any battle rifle on the market right now. After over 50 years, it still does.
Maybe. It's a gem of technology, light and precise, a weapon of the all-powerful America. But it disputes its world dominance with a fearsome adversary, the Russian AK-47. The story of Mikhail Kalashnikov can be read in the archives of the newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, or Red Star. The son of farmers deported by Stalin to the Gulag, young Kalashnikov had but one dream, mechanical engineering, and one ambition, to make farming machinery of all kinds. But his fate was changed by the war. A staff sergeant, he was commanding a tank when he was seriously wounded in October 1941.
It was heartbreaking for him. Several times he said, but for the Second World War, I would have invented something else entirely. He could have invented something that was economically very profitable. Whatever the case, the name of Kalashnikov would have become famous, not as the creator of a machine gun, but as the creator of another internationally competitive product. He had a gift for it.
At the hospital, the wounded talked to him about the superiority of the German guns, and in particular their machine gun, the STG-44. Kalashnikov duly dismantled and studied it. He became obsessed by the idea of creating the perfect weapon for the defense of his motherland.
He didn't attend university. He couldn't draw, but he had a very imaginative way of thinking. He would think, build his interior vision, take his decision, and then try to execute it. And he used to say over and over again, soldiers don't have degrees, so I built a simple gun, a soldier's gun.
In 1947, Mikhail Kalashnikov finally presented his prototype, codenamed Avtomat Kalashnikov. The AK-47 was born. A recipient of the Stalin Prize, he was sent more than 1,000 kilometers from Moscow to the arsenals of the city of Izhevsk, a closed city not found on the maps. In the summer of '49, when the Soviet General Staff chose the AK-47 as the standard issue gun for the Red Army, mass production of the most deadly weapon of all time could commence.
We worked round the clock, 3 8-hour shifts. We produced 600 guns per year. It always conjures up the image of a river. The conveyor belt was a river in which machine guns floated, and all of them worked. They were so well manufactured that you could dismantle 10 of them, change all the components around, and reassemble 10 guns that would function perfectly.
Kalashnikov's mechanical genius could be summed up in a few words: rustic, simple, and solid. The gun had to be resistant to cold, heat, sand, mud, and water. With its banana-shaped magazine and its 30 bullets, the gun weighed 5 kilos and 117 grams of steel and wood, boasted a cyclic rate of fire of 600 rounds per minute. The AK-47 was a revolution, the perfect weapon for modern warfare.
The 1950s were the most intense period of Kalashnikov production. Because our army needed them, and because other countries that had heard of them were demanding them too.
An enormous throng is massed in Beiping Square of Heavenly Peace. On the
In
balcony
1956,
overhead stand the top
Nikita
communists of
Khrushchev,
every
who had
country in the
succeeded
world,
Stalin,
headed by
gave Mao
Nikita
Zedong's
Khrushchev
Communist
and Mao
China
Zedong,
the
all
AK-47
gathered to help
license and
celebrate
assembly
the 10th
blueprints.
anniversary of Red China. Here is displayed the totalitarian showmanship that first became familiar in Rome.
At the height of the Cold War, the world was divided into two blocks, West and East. And the Kalashnikov and its assembly plants were also distributed throughout the sister countries of the Warsaw Pact. The Kalashnikov became the weapon that symbolized the communist bloc.
This weapon, the Kalashnikov, appeared at a time when the world order of olden days was collapsing. We were fighting for freedom, for a new life, for a new world. And we were fighting with this gun, the one built by Kalashnikov.
In January 1964, Fidel Castro was received in the USSR like a bosom buddy. An elk hunt was held with a hunting rifle for Khrushchev and Kalashnikov for Castro. It was a clear message. Cuba was an ally at the gates of America, an America within range of guns such as the Kalashnikov. It was a time for gifts and feasting. Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and North Korea, all anti-colonialists and anti-American, received their Kalashnikovs, the price of their friendship. The United States took more than 10 years to come up with a riposte to the Kalashnikov. It was called the M16.
On the American end, we are a very high technical society, a very industrialized society. With this rifle, we made use of modern materials. Rather than wood and steel, this was revolutionary with the use of synthetic materials and aluminum. The designer of this rifle was Gene Stoner, and his background was the aerospace industry with the use of aircraft-grade aluminums. This rifle was always considered to be space-aged.
In 1954, aeronautical engineer George Sullivan set up a small company, Armalite. He invited Eugene Stoner, a young metalworker with no university baggage, to join him as chief engineer. Their idea was to make guns rather like they make planes. The first prototypes of the future M16 were assembled in Sullivan's factory in California.
Stoner was very casual, and he had a very good sense of humor. His background, he too had no college degree or any university. He had been a machinist, but what was called a tool and die machinist, which is very special, very exacting work.
Stoner's stroke of genius was a revolutionary gas recovery system which avoided the use of a heavy piston. Made of plastics, glass fiber, composite materials, and aluminum, the finished product broke all weight records and tipped the scales at 3.12 kilos. The new M16 was a gun unlike any other.
It was just too new for a lot of people to be able to grasp. So the end result was the Army, at the time, all U.S. military weapons were made at U.S. arsenals. So the M14 was made by the Army at Rock Island Arsenal, Springfield Armory. They wanted to keep those businesses open because people's ranks and jobs depended on it. So they told the Army that there was no use for the M16 rifle.
Despite positive tests, the M16 wasn't picked for economic and political reasons. So the Marines arrived in Vietnam equipped with old M14 gun. This marked America's first encounter with the Kalashnikov. And it came as a shock. The fearsome firepower of the AK-47 stunned the young Marines.
When I turned 18, I landed in Vietnam, My older brother, my father, and my stepbrother were all Marines and all in Vietnam as well. The first time I heard of the Kalashnikov, the AK47, was about 4 days after I got in country. We opened fire first, and that's the first time I knew what that weapon was. The sound was extremely excruciating and distinctive. It was, our weapon was bang bang, if you will. Their weapon was cack cack cack. And it was a totally eerie sound. Quite frankly, as an 18-year-old, very scary.
With hundreds of thousands of units donated by the Soviet Union and China, the AK-47 was adopted by Vietnamese farmers. Instructors quickly turned it into a fearsome weapon. The duel between East and West, between Kalashnikov and M16, was played out in the jungles and paddy fields of Vietnam. The weapons were brought in via the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a 2,000-kilometer lifeline through the mountains and jungles. Thousands of men, and in particular women, were employed to transport 45 tons of material and the Kalashnikovs needed to arm the Viet Cong resistance. To combat the AK-47, in 1964, the Pentagon placed an urgent order for 100,000 M16s. In the general rush, and for reasons of economy, no user manual and only a very basic cleaning kit were planned for the new M16s. This situation made the Marines think that their gun only required a minimum of maintenance. The arrival of the M16 on the battlefield restored the balance between the forces. In battle, it proved to be much more precise than the Kalashnikov. But very soon, the difficult conditions of jungle mud and humidity laid bare the main weaknesses of the M16.
When I was in Vietnam, we captured a couple of weapons, which were the AK-47s. AK-47s, you could drag through the blood and the beer, and it'd still fire. With the M16, if it got a little wet, if it wasn't oiled, you had to, it would jam on you. So you had to maintain your M16 very well, and that's why I used to say it was my baby, because you had to make sure it was oiled, you had to make sure it was clean, you had to make sure you kept your muzzle protector on it so that it wouldn't get any sand or dirt in it, where the AK-47, all the sand, all the dirt, all the mud, everything else, that weapon would continue to fire.
In late April 1967, the Marines saw action near Khe Sanh. The men had just been issued with brand spanking new M16s. The battle for the hills was turned into carnage, with 150 Marines killed and several hundred more wounded. The unthinkable had happened. During the fighting, close to 40% of the M16s jammed and stopped firing. The breach blocked. Some officers even asked their soldiers to prepare to fight with bayonets.
They had so many problems with the M16 that some officers actually wrote letters in, including generals, saying they would prefer to carry the North Vietnamese AK-47 than M16s. They saw the AK being used by basically illiterate guerrillas and conventional soldiers who had had very little training, didn't take very good care of the weapon usually because of the environment they lived in, the jungle with all the heat and humidity and rain and mud and dust. But it always functioned. No one ever picked up a jammed AK-47 off the battlefield.
For the Marines, the hangover was dreadful. An openly derisive rumor did the rounds, saying that M16s weren't in fact made by the Colt factory, but by the toy maker Mattel. The boys had lost confidence in their weapon and in America.
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked when I read this, and I was ashamed, and I was, you know, I felt very bad. I mean, when you design something that maybe is for food for the soldiers, and they don't like it, that's one thing. But when they get killed because the instrument isn't good enough, then of course you feel ashamed.
A young lieutenant, Mike Chervenak, decided to alert public opinion, even if it meant defying his superiors.
I feel that it's my duty and responsibility to report the truth about this rifle as I've seen it. My conscience will not let me rest any longer. During a recent fight on the 21st of July, no fewer than 40 men in my company reported to me that their rifles had malfunctioned because of failure to extract. It's written out of concern for the safety of the men in my company and of the great morale problem that the M16 causes. I will stand and stake my reputation on the fact that we've had men wounded and perhaps killed because of inoperative rifles.
Several copies were sent out to Senator Robert Kennedy, the Washington Post, and to Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Richard Eichord.
As this began happening over and over again, reports moved very quickly to military command, and then ultimately reports found their way into the halls of the United States Congress. Reports that indicated that this weapon system had major problems. Those reports, some of them, even got read into the United States congressional record, where family members wrote their congressional representatives and their senators saying, my son was killed in the Hill battles. His life was lost, and his buddies wrote me to tell me that he died because his M16 rifle failed on the battlefield.
In October '67, the Eichord Subcommittee published a 51-page report whose conclusions were damning. The senators talked of criminal negligence and even of collusion between the military arsenals and the Colt firm for using, through greed, munitions unsuited to the proper functioning of the M16. Stoner and his team were exonerated.
First was the rifle was changed. There was two different types of propellant that were used in Vietnam. The rifle was designed around a propellant called IMR, or Improved Military Rifle. This caused the rate of fire to be around 600, 650 rounds a minute on the rifle. Well, without discussing with the designers, the Army decided to go with ball powder, which they traditionally have used since World War II, World War I. This propellant, actually, they had major surpluses of it. They switched to it without actually qualifying it as the rifle. So, criminal negligence, knowing that it's not going to cycle properly with the ammunition that it was being issued in combat, the Army would rather deal with that problem just to get production of the rifles out.
In the committee's first symbolic measure, a maintenance manual in the form of a comic book was published for the Marines. What better for learning to clean your rifle than advice from a curvaceous cartoon pinup?
Everybody had a name for their weapon, pretty much everybody in country. Mine was a simple Betsy. I swear by the weapon. It was part of us. It wasn't just a gun, it was part of us. It was very much part of it, it was family.
The improvements made to the M16 were legion. The chamber and barrel were chrome-plated to combat rust, and a new powder used, but nothing could do the trick. Even though it wasn't the cause, the M16 lost the Vietnam War. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975. An army of peasants with Kalashnikovs had conquered the all-powerful U.S. Army. It was no longer a retreat, it was a debacle.
For a period of time, the AK-47 became the legend that was associated with revolutionary movements around the world, specifically Marxist revolutionary movements.
In Santiago, Chile, a crowd has gathered to celebrate the victory of Salvador Allende in the 1970 presidential elections. Here he is receiving his friend Fidel Castro.
Que siempre estuvo y estará
With Cuba, Chile had become the second country in the South American continent to fall under Marxist influence, a red stain in America's backyard. Fidel Castro gives a Kalashnikov to his comrade in the struggle, a gift with a symbolic value.
I think we have to look at the United States when it had direct military programs in countries like South America. You see South Americans and their police carrying M16s. You see any number of countries where the United States is backing a dictator. I mean, the United States supports, where you look at, a dictatorship.
The coup d'etat took place in the morning of September 11, 1973. Encouraged by the CIA, the Chilean military junta, led by General Pinochet, attacked the presidential palace. The last known photograph of the president, still alive, surrounded by his bodyguards, he is holding the Kalashnikov given by Castro. During the attack, President Allende was murdered, though they called it suicide, with his own Kalashnikov. The repression was terrible. More than 300,000 people were arrested, tortured, executed, and, as the prisons were full, the stadiums were filled under the guard of M16s. In the mid-1970s, the war between the M16 and the Kalashnikov found a new front in Lebanon. M16s for the Israeli army, the Lebanese army, and the Christian militia. Kalashnikovs for the Syrian troops, the Shiite militia, and the Palestinian OLP. In this urban war, the weapons wielded are a badge of political and religious affiliation. Yasser Arafat, head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, declared, "I come bearing an olive branch in one hand and the freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." To maintain peace, at the UN's behest, 200 French paratroopers landed in Beirut in April 1978. Their mission was to intervene between the Israeli army and the Palestinian Fayadin in South Lebanon. The French army made its first acquaintance with the Kalashnikov on the evening of May 1st. It was a deadly encounter.
We clashed with a group and 3 of them broke away and were armed with Kalashnikovs. The Palestinian officer tried to calm them down, and so did I, but they immediately cocked their rifles and opened fire. The 3 guys opposite me were armed with Kalashnikovs, and they fired all together, simultaneously.
2 paratroopers were killed instantly. Colonel Salvan, seriously wounded, was evacuated by helicopter to a hospital in Gaza.
Colonel Salvan, head of the French Blue Helmets in South Lebanon, is over the worst. At least that's his verdict. This paratrooper officer, I mind you, had been shot 10 times in the legs.
Depending on the various surgeons treating me, I took between 18 and 12 from the soles of my feet up to my nose, which was injured once again. I probably felt the hand of God on me that day.
In Moscow, statues in parks are a reminder to passers-by of the Russian soldiers who died in combat in Afghanistan.
I was in Afghanistan for more than 2 years, from 1984 to 1986. And of course, I spent the 2 years clutching my Kalashnikov. I would never say that it was just an inanimate object. I owed my existence, my life, and those of my friends to that object. And there's no doubt that there was an intimate communication with the Kalashnikov. From the start, whether consciously or subconsciously, it was, "Don't let me down, darling. Help me out here." That was the strength of it.
Sure of its power, the Red Army entered Afghanistan on December 24, 1979. Its mission, to support Kabul's communist regime. Mikhail Kalashnikov paid a surprise visit to the front. He wanted to evaluate his weapon, the new AK-74, in the field amongst the soldiers.
When our soldiers went to Afghanistan, they fought the enemy with this weapon and then came and talked to him. For an inventor, it was a great moment, but he was always asked for their remarks. It was part of his perfectionism. He always said, soldiers have no diplomas, and I created a soldier's weapon. But I think it was a soldier who created a soldier's weapon.
If I'm asked to compare the Kalashnikov and the M16, my first impression was that the M16 rifle is a young lady who's fairly capricious, delicate, and irritable. As for the Kalashnikov, he's a poor, stern Russian peasant who does his job and does it in such a way that whoever stands in his way will pay the price. That's my view of these weapons.
The future of the war in Afghanistan was played out in the United States, with the CIA holding the controls. They looked to arm the Afghan resistance, and with perfect cynicism, they chose the Kalashnikov rather than the M16 to defeat the Soviets.
There was a conscious decision when it came to arming the Afghans to use Kalashnikovs. A lot of these Kalashnikovs were simply recycled through several arms dealers and ended up in Pakistan. And what we didn't want on the Kalashnikovs is any American fingerprint, literal or otherwise, and certainly not the serial numbers. There was sort of a revenge factor because you had the Soviet Union handing out Kalashnikovs in, for instance, Angola, and we were simply turning their national resistance movements against them. So now we're saying, well, here's your weapons back, have a good time.
On the Afghan border in Pakistan, the CIA, with the help of the Pakistani secret services and the financial backing of Saudi Arabia, organized the delivery of weapons to the training camps. Osama bin Laden, working for the Americans, was in charge of recruiting men to fight the Soviets. In an irony of history, bin Laden, tool of the CIA, was executed in 2008 by American commandos armed with M16s. Bin Laden still had his trusty Kalashnikov by his side. Along with Kalashnikovs, the Americans also delivered Stinger missiles to the Afghan rebels. The Red Army soon lost their mastery of the skies, and with it, the war.
I think that Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. There are a lot of reasons why the Soviet Union collapsed, but one of them was the sheer expense of the war in Afghanistan. It wasn't heavy weapons that beat the Russians, it was the Kalashnikov, their own weapon.
On February 15, 1989, 10 years after its arrival, the Red Army, defeated, left Afghanistan. In a terrible domino effect, the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR collapsed. In the post-Soviet chaos, the doors to the arsenals were opened and huge stocks of Kalashnikovs became available to the highest bidder.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a large surplus of these weapons, and they were both sold legitimately as well as criminally to the black market, and these weapons wound up in places such as Africa, or Middle East, terrorist groups. Anybody who had the money to buy them, there was a black market and they were able to sell them, and sell them cheaply.
In a wholesale sell-off, millions of weapons awaited a customer, but few of them were M16s. Their names were Bount, Sogonayan, Falcon, and Minin. They were Russian, Lebanese, French, and Ukrainian, all merchants of death. The most powerful, an American, was Samuel Cummings.
I'm optimistic because I'm an optimist by nature, but also because I have always believed, and I have no reason to change that opinion, that the military arms business is basically based on human folly, not on human wisdom. And I think we can both agree that human folly has never been measured and has always existed and always will.
The El Dorado of arms dealers was Africa, an annual market of $5 billion. Smuggled in with fake certificates, these weapons fueled the civil wars. Dollars, diamonds, gold, and minerals bought all these Kalashnikovs. There were almost 300,000 child soldiers. For them, the light, easy-to-use AK-47 was the ideal weapon. Sheena was just 9 years old when she was kidnapped by the NRA, a Ugandan militia. Today, her daughter is the same age.
I remember always shooting with this gun. You can never forget. It becomes a stamp to your body, to your life, to your memory. You'll never forget the sound of this gun. It has a very special sound, and it's very strange because when you heard this gun shooting, you can always tell it has shoot something or it has shoot in the air by the different sound of this gun.
He's a soldier.
We were told that you had to love Kalashnikov more like it was your mother. That's what they put it. Love this gun like it was your mother. And love this gun more than you love yourself. Instead of losing this gun, they said, it's better you lose yourself.
UN Secretary General Kofi Annan declared in 2001, you can buy an AK-47 for $15 or a sack of grains. It is easy to use with minimal training. Even a child can use it, and it will last for decades.
This gun is responsible for taking away our childhood, which we'll never get, taking our memory, our history. We've lost our childhood friends, we've lost our parents. I have nobody left because of this gun. I think Mikhail Kalashnikov should know, but it's too late for him to have never created this light weapon which any child can carry.
In 1989, Mikhail Kalashnikov, a simple sergeant, was still an engineer at the plant where they made his weapon. He was earning less than $500 a month and still living in the same two-room apartment when an article in the American press changed his life.
I have the rank of colonel, and it really was thanks to the Americans. One day they wrote that a simple sergeant armed all the Warsaw Pact countries. So my superiors reacted, and I found myself promoted to colonel.
Я начал быстро расти и дорос до полковника запаса.
For Kalashnikov, it was a year of surprises. Freshly promoted to colonel, he received an invitation from the United States. And the Soviet government improbably accepted. Eugene Stoner, creator of the M16, welcomed his arch-rival Kalashnikov.
When Eugene Stoner and Kalashnikov met, they became friends, which may seem unusual, because of the antagonism between the two countries. Russia and the United States, of course, were bitter enemies during the Cold War.
With the Cold War forgotten, the duel was transformed into a friendly shooting competition. The American stoner shouldered the AK-47, while Kalashnikov, the Russian colonel, fired the M16. Once rivals, they were already friends.
Let's get together again real soon.
I'm ready for the new meeting.
Well, perhaps we can collaborate on a new design.
I agree. We can work on it together.
The NRA, or National Rifle Association, would have been thrilled by such a collaboration. Here in the land of the Second Amendment, 200 million weapons are in circulation. The darling remains the M16. It is even nicknamed Barbie doll. But with 200,000 units sold annually, the Kalashnikov AK-47, formerly the weapon of communists, is now a bestseller on the American market.
Well, basically, one of the main reasons why it's so popular is its cost efficiency. It's not a very expensive weapon to begin with. This one specifically is $665, whereas an M16 type rifle generally is going to be somewhere in the realm of $1,200 to $1,500 to $2,000. The reality is Hollywood has produced the image of an AK-47 as a very frightening weapon. In my opinion, produce a desire for some of these criminals and thugs to have those same weapons because they think it's cool based on what they've seen in Hollywood.
In Hollywood, the Kalashnikov was winning the image war. It walked off with the Oscar for the most frightening weapon. Here, 30,000 people die each year, mown down by a bullet from one of the 5 million M16s and Kalashnikovs in circulation.
Now, I'm an M16 fan, and I collect M16s, and I have a number of them, over 10 of them, in fact. And in the aftermath of the hurricane, living in downtown New Orleans, where all law and order had fallen to the wayside, and people were carjacking and looting, this is the firearm that I chose to carry on me. And I can testify to one important thing about the AK-47, and this specific one particularly, and that is that when potential evildoers encountered me on the streets in New Orleans in the aftermath of that hurricane, and they saw this, they immediately got away from me as fast as they could. Just the sight of an AK made them leave me the hell alone.
Kalashnikov would say, terrorists aren't stupid. They choose the best weapons. Gangs in Marseille, to defend their territory in turf wars, also chose the Kalashnikov, an easily available weapon, unlike the M16.
The Kalashnikovs came mainly from the former Yugoslavia. That's the simple explanation. Yugoslavia was in a state of unrest in the early 1990s, with conflicts in Bosnia and Croatia. So they built up an enormous stock of weapons of war at that time. And when the fighting ceased, everyone took an inventory. They kept a few weapons, thinking the fighting may start again, but they also sold massive quantities.
A Kalashnikov that's now in Marseille in the hands of a teenager might already have murdered in Srebrenica or killed an innocent civilian during the siege of Sarajevo. Guns have no memory. With the war over, the former soldiers organized an export business. Private cars, coaches, and trucks were the most discreet way of passing the border. A traffic of worker ants using every available crossing point. In January 2007, a secret arsenal was discovered in 3 caches in Bouches-du-Rhône and Var. 51 Kalashnikovs, submachine guns, revolvers, in all close to 200 weapons. Directing the traffic was Vonko Lukic, a Croatian ex-serviceman.
Buying a Kalashnikov does cost a bit, though. If you want a good quality weapon on today's black market, you're looking at 2,500, 3,000 euros. With that, you usually get 1 or 2 charges of 30 bullets. If you find a 500 euro Kalashnikov, it's in a poor state, or there's plenty of blood on the butt.
I can't look at an AK-47 without thinking of the Beslan school massacre. I can't look at an AK-47 without thinking of Charlie Hebdo. I can't look at an AK-47 without thinking of Osama bin Laden. Because of the global proliferation of the Kalashnikov design, every little radical around the world who can get their hands on this can etch their name into the log of history by simply taking human lives.
January 7th to 9th, 2015, the Kalashnikov sowed waves of horror in Paris. Amedy Coulibaly and the Kouachi brothers murdered 17 people in the editorial offices of the magazine Charlie Hebdo and in a kosher grocery in Vincennes. On November 13th, other lunatics allegedly from Daesh murdered 130 innocents. The signature on all these massacres was Kalashnikov, the weapon of terror. The Kalashnikov, weapon of choice of religious and other terrorists, is also the weapon of civil wars. Since Russia's annexation of the Crimea, Ukraine has been plunged into a war between loyalist forces and separatists backed by Moscow. All of those entrenched on the front line are sustained by the same God, all speak the same language, and all kill each other with the same gun, the Kalashnikov. A fratricidal war that divides neighbors, friends, and even members of the same family. You could call it the curse of the Kalashnikov.
I know several families where a son set off with his Kalashnikov to fight with the Ukrainian army, while the father went with his Kalashnikov with the separatists. Families pitting father against son, the same blood, with the same guns, Kalashnikov rifles.
At the military cemetery in Quantico, near Washington, Kalashnikov has come to honor his rival and friend, Eugene Stoner, with a final visit. Different in every way, Stoner became a multimillionaire thanks to the patent on his M16. Kalashnikov simply gave his name to his gun. Their heritage is massive and monstrous. 10 million M16s and 100 million Kalashnikovs. Weapons that have escaped their creators to feature in every war and in every slaughter.
And so the old era of looking at the AK-47 as a symbol of revolution, I believe, is over with. Because when most people look at the AK-47 now, they see it, I believe, as a symbol of a destructive ideology, of terrorism, of an ideology that is being destroyed by law and order. And law and order carries the M16 now.
On September 11th, 2001, the Twin Towers collapsed in New York. America was struck at its heart, and the M16 would be the weapon of vengeance, tasked with reestablishing law and order, Pax Americana. So they set off for Afghanistan, and where the Soviets with their Kalashnikovs had lost the Battle of Kabul, the Americans thought they could win it with their M16s.
That's one thing that we saw fighting in the desert. It's just harsh. It's hard territory. It's the harshest environment I've ever been in. Our M4s had a tendency to go down a lot. You know, you get a little bit of dust in there and they'd go down, they'd jam up or they'd overheat. So whenever we went up against the AK-47 Kalashnikovs in Iraq and Afghanistan, you definitely did have a respect for it, so that we understood that it was a very powerful weapon. I had friends that were shot by AK-47s, and seeing what it did to you was, you had to have respect for it.
Respect and disillusionment. 10 years of fighting ended in failure for the all-powerful U.S. Army. The Taliban and their Kalashnikovs resisted the American M16s throughout. Since the time of Alexander the Great, no army, not the troops of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, or those of the United States, have been able to conquer and subdue the Afghans. After Afghanistan, the Star-Spangled Banner was hoisted in Baghdad. Operation Iraqi Freedom was a success. Saddam's Kalashnikovs could do nothing against the M16s of the over-equipped U.S. troops. As the price of his arrogance, the bronze statue of Saddam was cast to the ground. Though the M16 thought it had won the Battle of Iraq, it has still not won the war. In this urban guerrilla combat, the rebels' Kalashnikovs was a reminder that peace could only be won down the barrel of an M16. But in ambushes or surprise attacks, carrying an M16 is no guarantee of safe passage.
We have a symbol that every soldier knows, and that's when a fallen soldier is remembered. We put a helmet on top of a M16 next to his boots. And the reason why we do that, the helmet is his protection, his weapon is his baby, and the boots, no cowboy dies without his boots.
On December 18, 2011, the American forces pulled out of Iraq. Before leaving, the Americans had trained the new Iraqi army. They generously left their M16s behind, so the Iraqis could try to maintain the peace in this field of ruins and hate between tribes, between Shiite and Sunni, and under the threat of Daesh. Kalashnikovs were passed on from father to son. Today in Iraqi Kurdistan, they'd love to swap for a far more modern M16. But on the black market, with the threat of Daesh, prices are soaring.
The price of a Kalashnikov is between $1,000 and $1,500. If it's new, it could cost up to $2,000. But an M16 will cost between $5,000 and $10,000. I bought mine for $9,800. The M16 is more powerful than the Kalashnikov, faster and prettier, and as they say, it's more fashionable.
M16s are fashionable, but rare among the Peshmergas. They have only their Kalashnikovs to face the Islamic State forces of Daesh in Iraq and the Levant. Rich from oil money, looting and trafficking, Daesh is fighting with American M16s, arms bought or stolen from the Iraqi army.
Daesh, they've got M16s because the Iraqi army collapsed, and that's what they got. But that's more of a very peculiar symbol in the sense that the Iraqi army can't fight. They were given all these weapons by the United States, new M4s, which is essentially the M16. They were given all these weapons and they didn't know how to use them. And so Daesh now at this point is a source of pride that they have M16, that they disarmed the Iraqi army.
حاليا الآن ولله الحمد والمنة نحن الآن على الحدود ما بين أرض الشام وأرض الرافدين ولله والمنة.
Daesh is an evil cancer, born in the desert, preaching a nebulous Islamist ideology, fed on Arab money, frustration, hate, and our strategic errors. Under the black banner of Muhammad, M16s and Kalashnikovs are brandished, and they have lost all symbolic value. In Moscow, too, symbols are aging and disappearing. The last socialist hero, one of the most decorated and honored men in the whole of Russia, General Mikhail Kalashnikov, passed away at the age of 94 on Christmas Eve, 2013.
The ceremony was held at the military pantheon. The protocol was simple: words of affection, a notion of flowers. Military dignitaries and the head of state came together in the suburbs of Moscow to pay a final tribute to Mikhail Kalashnikov. Everybody wanted to honor this wonderful inventor.
A funeral worthy of a hero. Yet in the twilight of his life, ravaged by doubt, Kalashnikov sought comfort in the church. My pain is unbearable. And I keep asking this insoluble question. My gun has taken away human lives, so am I responsible for the deaths of these humans, even though they were enemies? As a young man, he said he wanted to invent farm machinery, but he created the perfect weapon. Today, there are more than 100 million of his deadly creatures throughout the world, 10 times more than his rival Stoner's M16. Kalashnikov certainly won that lethal game.